Good evening. My name is David Solomon. I'm the director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, and I would like to welcome all of you to our 5th annual fall conference. We're starting a little late because there's some the fog has slowed some people down, and we were waiting to let a few more people get here, but they will be drifting in as the evening moves on. This fall, in addition to this conference, we've also celebrated with another conference our 5th anniversary as an academic center, the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame on this campus. And throughout the 5 years of our center, these conferences have been the centerpiece of our work, although they've been far from the only things that we have undertaken. We have a table in the book room across the hall in the back with materials about our other activities over these last 5 years, and we invite you to look over these materials and give us feedback on them. We also have there a place where all of you can put yourself on our permanent mailing list if you want to be, and you can keep up with what we're doing. Our earlier conferences have explored themes that have emerged from a perspective on contemporary culture, anchored in traditional Catholic teaching on ethics, politics, and culture. We've not hidden the fact that we're especially inspired by the encyclicals and other writings of Pope John Paul II, writings that have developed in exquisite detail both a critique of certain features of contemporary culture, features that many of us find disturbing, and also an inspiring vision of what our culture could be. Our first 2 conferences, the first on the culture of death, the second on the culture of life, set the stage for all that has come after. Our conferences in the past have had diverse presentations, but it's fair to say that they have focused, for the most part, on the more theoretical parts of the vision that we're exploring. Philosophy, theology, political theory, and the social sciences have tended to dominate our discussions. This year we're trying something different, and I must say it's something that we have pursued with some trepidation. All of us in the center have been inspired by the Pope's letter to artists, issued on Easter Sunday, April 4th, 1999. In it, he reminds us of the close and reciprocal relation between the arts and religion throughout the history of both. We were emboldened by this document to announce this conference on Epiphanies of Beauty, a phrase we take from the document itself, and to invite to this conference artists and those who reflect on the work of artists together here, invite them together here this weekend to exhibit their work and to engage in sustained conversation about the place of art, the arts, in post-Christian culture. Those of you who have attended our conferences in the past will recognize some familiar features of this conference. We're having a lot going on, and many of the things going on conflict with other things going on. We have over 130 presentations of various sorts. Our contributors come from all parts of the academic and non-academic worlds. We have distinguished world class, as we like to say in the Academy, scholars on our program. We also have graduate students. I suppose some of them may be world class too. Independent scholars, artists, performers, undergraduates, and as always, we have a couple of presentations by high school students. One of the students who read a paper here a couple of years ago as a high school student is returning this year to read a paper as an undergraduate at Princeton. I hope that we can have her back in a couple of years as a graduate student, a little later as a faculty member, and finally a curmudgeonly professor emeritus like the rest of us, lamenting the passing of the good old days. We have many undergraduate students from schools around the country in attendance, and we welcome them all. For those of you who are first-time visitors to the University of Notre Dame, I'd like to welcome you to our beautiful campus, although in this season, and especially this evening, I'm afraid, it has a bit of a Lenten appearance. You will find it a friendly place to visit, and we hope you will take the opportunity to explore it while you are here. This campus itself is in its way an epiphany of beauty. You will find spread throughout this building we're in, the McKenna Hall, various pieces of art, displayed carefully for your enjoyment. For most of those pieces of art, we also have in attendance the artists who created them. We have asked them to stand in the vicinity of their works during breaks in this conference, and we invite all the participants in the conference to engage them in conversations about their work. Some of the artists will also be giving presentations, specific presentations, about the works that they have on display here. Across from the back of the auditorium is a room full of book displays, and it will be fuller tomorrow when everybody arrives. We have a large number of presses displaying books here, and we invite you to visit all of them. Many authors giving presentations at this conference have books on display in those exhibits, and you're welcome to track those authors down to have them sign their books. We'll also be having a formal book signing period tomorrow from 3:10 to 3:40 for new books over in the book room by Michael Scaparlanda and by Father Robert Lauder. They'll be signing from 3:10 to 3:40 tomorrow. The Snite Museum on campus, which is just about a 1-minute walk around out sort of over toward the football stadium, has been very helpful to us in setting up this conference. And you'll find in your conference packet some material introducing you to that museum. The Snite is one of the finest university art museums in the country, and if you've never visited it, you should take the opportunity to do so while you're here. Their collection spans the entire history of world art, and it's exquisitely displayed. We have a formal tour of that museum scheduled on both Friday and Saturday afternoons. The time is in your packet materials. If the weather is nice, this tour will begin at the X Center, which is a building sort of right across the street a little bit to your left. And it will explore not only the Snite, but some of the sculptures on campus, including the magnificent Mestroviches that we have distributed around the place, and they're not to be missed. If the weather's not nice, the tour will begin in the Snite, and you'll have to find the Mestroviches on your own. There are plenty of maps as to where they are. The museum has also extended its hours for visitors to this conference. It will remain open until 7:30 on both Friday and Saturday nights for the convenience of people who are attending the conference. The interior of our 19th century French Baroque basilica at the center of the campus also has a recently restored interior, as does the administration building on campus. That's the one under the Golden Dome, and you should try not to miss those. There's a vigil mass in the basilica on Saturday night at 5 o'clock, along with lots of other masses, but the vigil mass on 5 o'clock is at 5 o'clock on Saturday is one that many people who attend this conference also attend. You're welcome to go. Okay, a couple of final housekeeping details. Sorry about getting the delay in getting this underway. Undergraduates who are sleeping in the Knights of Columbus Hall, as part of our tradition, on the floor, I hope they've told you that, should meet our undergraduate assistant, Kate Wilson, who will be down at the front of the auditorium at the end of this lecture, if you need any help in finding your way over there. She will also answer any other questions visiting undergrads may have about where to go and what to do on campus, the kinds of questions that I would have no idea how to answer. I will remind you, all the undergraduates and everybody, that there will be a special concert tomorrow night for undergraduates at La Fortune Student Center from 9:30. We know it's for undergraduates because it starts at 9:30 and ends at 1 o'clock. That's a.m. A musical group, including some former Notre Dame students, are putting on this special concert as part of our conference. I'm not sure that what they're doing will count as art, and I was saying perhaps we might vote on that. Adults may go to this too, 9:30 in La Fortune Student Center. And finally, just a word about food before we bring Greg Wolfe on stage. We had a lot of late registrants at this conference, and some of you will find yourself as, alas, culinary second-class citizens. All of our meals will be downstairs in this building. But if you find yourself with a blue name tag, that means that you registered so late that you do not have a right to demand a place at our meals. But I hasten to add, all is not lost. You do not have a right to a meal. But there's always a lot of empty seats at our meals, and we simply ask those of you with blue tags to hang back a little bit until all of those with white tags, who do have a right to a meal, have been seated. In the past, we have found that everyone finally finds a seat. I've always thought this is a bit like the loaves and fishes, only different. You may even, I hasten to add, join us at the meals if you have no name tag, if you've just wandered in off the street. But in order to do that, you have to wait behind both the white name tags and the blue name tags. Now, to keep all this straight, we have an official bouncer in the dining room, Eric Grabowski. Eric, raise your hand. Eric was trained in the Polish bars in Pittsburgh. He's a graduate student at Duquesne, and he will be at the door downstairs to take care of all of these matters. And I advise you to do whatever he tells you to do. Now, if we do run out of seats in the dining room, Eric can give you meal coupons for the Notre Dame student cafeteria, which actually serves pretty good food too. But you don't get those until all the seats are filled, and Eric will keep track of that. Finally, all of the events of this conference will be held in this building except the Snite Tours, which is in the Snite Museum, as I say, just a minute away, and tomorrow night's performance, which will be in the Annenberg Auditorium. This is a performance of some of Messiaen's piano music with commentary, and the entrance to the Annenberg Theater is also, the Annenberg Auditorium is also in the Snite Museum. Everything else will be in this building. Okay, so much for announcements. On to the main event. Have I left out anything in the way of bookkeeping details? I have all sorts of people that keep me from making gross mistakes about these matters. All right. We're honored tonight to have as our keynote speaker at this conference one of the most creative and exciting young minds, I think, now writing about the arts and religion. Gregory Wolfe. Greg is the publisher and editor of Image. It's such a handsome magazine. I'll hold up a recent edition. A journal of the arts and religion, as it calls itself. Image, copies of this journal are on display in the book room across the way. And it recently celebrated its 15th anniversary. It seems to me just like yesterday when it was founded. And throughout those 15 years, it has published a wide range of fiction, poetry, and criticism, exploring, as no other contemporary journal, the meeting place of artistic creativity and religious experience. In addition to his important and influential work through this journal, Greg has authored and edited a number of books, including his widely read biography of Malcolm Muggeridge, and more recently, his work, Sacred Passion, The Art of William Schickel, and he published that with our own Notre Dame Press. William Schickel, as you know, the object of this study, is also with us at this conference and will be making a presentation later in it. The painting that adorns our brochure, this wonderful painting for this conference, is also from the hand of William Schickel, and that painting is hanging just opposite the door at the rear of this auditorium and will be on display throughout the conference. William Schickel is himself a Notre Dame graduate, and a number of his artworks adorn our campus. We're happy to welcome him back to campus along with our speaker tonight, who has written so inspiringly about Bill Schickel's work. 2 new books of essays by Greg Wolfe have recently been published: Intruding Upon the Timeless, Meditations on Art, Faith, and Mystery, and a second book of essays, Beauty Will Save the World, Art, Faith, and the Stewardship of Culture. Greg has also published essays, reviews, and articles in numerous journals, including Commonweal and First Things, a rare double that in journals of opinion, and many other leading journals of opinion. Greg was educated at Hillsdale College as an undergraduate, where he studied with a great Notre Dame figure, Gerhard Niemeyer, who taught at Hillsdale after retiring at Notre Dame. Professor Niemeyer, incidentally, was both a great political theorist and a passionate artist himself, a musician playing his viola da gamba with a group of fallow early music fans for years in his living room here in South Bend. Greg's graduate education in English literature was at Oxford University. He's held a number of academic positions in this country and is presently writer-in-residence and director of the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at Seattle Pacific University, a program that he has himself created. Greg Wolfe has said and written many things in the last 15 years from which we can all learn. But nothing so important, I think, as his many statements of resistance to the vulgar reduction of deep cultural tensions in contemporary society to the merely political. In this regard, he's famously referred to himself as a conscientious objector in the culture wars. In this season of political exhaustion for many of us, I'd like to quote Greg briefly on this matter as we bring him on stage. In an essay in his most recent image, he says, quote, "The twin sources of culture are art and religious faith. From these two springs come the fundamental symbols and emotional attachments of a social order. Because ideological politics tends to reduce these symbols to slogans and to channel emotions into tribalistic anger and resentment, we must engage in a vigorous effort to renew our cultural life by purifying the sources." No one has worked harder than Greg Wolfe in this endeavor to purify those sources. He will speak to us this evening on the topic, Shouts or Whispers, Faith and Doubt in Contemporary American Literature. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Well, I would like to welcome all of you to this extraordinary session of the Security Council. I believe that the representative from Ghana will read the minutes now. I'm just joking. Professor Solomon was making a few jokes at the expense of this room and its UN-like nature and the oddness of our hollow donut here in the middle of the room. I was thinking I might be closer down by the peeps there, but apparently it was not to be. I'm back up here across this vast sea of emptiness. So those of you who don't want to get spat upon can certainly thank your lucky stars, but I will try as best I can to defeat the distance between us. It's a great honor to be here. I have only been to Notre Dame twice before, and both of those occasions were strictly in relation to football. In fact, I was here to see football games in the personal sponsorship of Professor Gerhard Niemeyer, who was, I think I could say I minored in Gerhard Niemeyer at Hillsdale College. I took every course of his that he taught as a visiting professor. And those of you who knew him knew that he was a very formidable figure, European, always serious, groomed, intense. We used to joke at Hillsdale that his favorite word was wrong. That's not entirely fair to the man. He was a man of great generosity and fun. And the fun part certainly came out at those Notre Dame football games. I knew that when I got invited to attend one of those, I had really become something of a disciple, or in the inner circle at the very least. I should have known just the intensity of that fanaticism when I saw him pick up a special Notre Dame cushion to carry with him to the stadium. This was a guy who had season tickets. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised to see this man, intense, European, severe, when the first moment of the ball leaving the kicker's foot and the opening kickoff, leap out of his seat and say, "Kill him!" That was a wonderful side to Gerhard Niemeyer. I'm glad to finally be here in a different setting as well. I'm also sorry that I am not back where I should be at home for my son's 9th birthday. So thank your stars for that too. This is the youngest of 4. He's a very serious young man himself. He most recently stunned us by turning to us in some store or other of some temple of American consumerism, pointing to a piece of high-priced playware of some kind, and arching his eyebrow and saying to Mom, "What would Jesus do?" Jesus wasn't in a buying mood that night. As my own little housekeeping announcement, I should say that those copies of Image are not merely for display, they are also for sale. And And there are quite a few of them out there that I'd rather not carry back to Seattle, Washington. Hope you're interested. Well, I would like to give you some observations tonight from what I call the editor's chair. I am certainly under the non-academic category of people who are speaking at this sort of event. I'm a writer and an editor, and I have been able, over the last 15 years, to keep a pretty steady gaze on this intersection of art and faith. Annie Dillard calls it a pileup where art and faith collide. And so I will speak from my knowledge. I'll speak from the realm of literature because, again, it's what I know best, although in the question session there may be people who might want to try to draw analogies between some of the things that I've been saying, whether in agreement or disagreement, and possibly other art forms such as, say, music or the visual arts. There has been a resurgence of art created in the last 20, 30 years that engages the Judeo-Christian tradition in a very serious and sustained way. It's an odd situation because this resurgence is not widely known or appreciated. Image is attempting in its particular way to chronicle it, but we're hardly alone. There are a host of other journals, books, organizations such as Christians in the Visual Arts, Christians in the Theater Arts, springing up all over the place, things that are making a real difference in academia, in seminaries, in local churches. But it's a funny thing, this resurgence. It's something that's not well known, and at times I feel that when I go around trying to talk about it, people would rather that it not be true when I try to explain that it's going on. I found the hardest job in America is telling people good news. It's like, nah, I don't want to hear that. And we all know it's going to hell in a handbasket, you know? But there really is something interesting going on right now. And what I'd like to do tonight is simply try to set some of the interesting emergence of art in this realm, particularly in the literary world that I'm going to draw upon, and compare and contrast it to a similar renaissance that took place in the mid-20th century with the great writers. Of course, many of them belonged to the Catholic literary revival, as it was called, such as Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, Francois Mauriac, Georges Bernanos, and to some extent the Americans, Walker Percy and Flannery O'Connor. Others could be included, T.S. Eliot probably most famously. And I hope that by doing a compare and contrast, we can look a little bit at what is unique and different about our own time, and weigh the pros and cons of those differences, and perhaps draw some interesting conclusions, ones we might not have normally thought we would take. I'm using the distinction between shouts and whispers because I'm stealing shamelessly from an essay that I published. It seems doubly wrong to publish an essay and then plagiarize from it, but I'm admitting my sin right off the bat, and I've been given the blessing by the author, a wonderful Southern novelist named Doris Betts, published an essay in Image a number of years ago called Whispering Hope. And in it, she described how she, as a Southern Christian writer, revered the great Flannery O'Connor. You know, O'Connor once said that to be a Southern writer in the shadow of Faulkner was like having a little dog and mule, a mule and trap sort of on the tracks while the Dixie Limited was coming down. Well, of course, writers writing in the shadow of Flannery O'Connor feel that she's her own form of Dixie Limited coming down, and it can be a very difficult thing. Well, Betts was doing her best to define her own sense of what her mode of engaging faith within the artifact of the literary work. And she said, you know, I've reflected deeply and with profit upon O'Connor's great credo, or at least her famous statement of methodology, and you all probably know it. She said famously in one of those terrific essays in that terrific collection, Mystery and Manners, that the Christian writer, and she in particular, has, in a time of unbelief and of religious amnesia, that for the hard of hearing you have to shout, and for the nearly blind you have to draw large and startling figures. And Doris Betts said, I understand this completely, and it worked beautifully in O'Connor's art, but I don't feel that I am a shouter. Shouting is not the mode in which I feel I connect to my faith, and I connect to the way that I can embody it in my art. I feel that for me it's more of the whisper. And I love that distinction. I loved it because it really seemed to be true about Betts' own work, which I love, and I heartily commend it to you, especially her great novel, Souls Raised from the Dead. But it got me to thinking a lot more about what the implications of that might be for the larger realm of art being created in the more postmodern environment. And so the nature and essence and subject of this talk. Those great writers of the middle of the century that we love so passionately, Waugh, Green, O'Connor, Percy, they were all, I think, in some way, shape, or form modeled and shaped and influenced and formed by modernism, by the great 20th century movement of literary modernism. And you may know and know well what some of the great characteristics of modernism are, but I'll run down a few just for the heck of it. You might recall that modernists loved the grand system. They loved myth. They loved the idea of trying to take something ancient, the way Joyce took Ulysses, of course, Homer's Odyssey, and make it a kind of structure, a deep structure for art. And the way that, for example, Picasso took tribal cultures and used the kind of primitive earthiness of tribal culture to provide a kind of new, deep structure for modern man. Or the way Stravinsky, called on primitive music in The Rite of Spring. Eliot, of course, in The Wasteland, calling on the Golden Bough and all the Fisher King myth and all the mythic elements, Wagner and everything that made The Wasteland so resonant with allusions. These authors believed, and artists believed, in the grand gesture, the dramatic gesture. The characters of Graham Greene, while they're not, the style is not in high modernism, there is a kind of big gesture there. Even the Whiskey Priest, however bumbling and pathetic he may be, meets a pretty intense end in a martyrdom to a modern totalitarian society in a kind of hot, dusty Mexican landscape. The modernists believed that when it came to faith, one had to almost create a silhouette in the work of art, a dark patch that might resemble something like the shape of God or the shape of the church. So you get somebody like Evelyn Waugh in Brideshead Revisited, creating in the character really of the house of Brideshead a kind of visual metaphor for the Catholic Church. And its presence is only hinted at, but it has a kind of palpable impact, as if it was a character in its own right. Samuel Beckett's writings, Waiting for Godot and others, are famous for their use of the idea of absence, trying to help us to get to a presence that has been lost in a modern secular environment. So irony, too, is natural for these writers. Irony, extended irony, in which God's absence had to be implied by the reader. One thinks, for example, of T.S. Eliot's poem, Ariel poem, Journey of the Magi. Here is an entire poem whose title indicates the traditional motif of the Nativity, leading us to think about a little baby and ox and ass and Joseph and Mary and angels and shepherds and what have you. The entire poem, of course, has not one of these entities in it at all, not even a mention of even child, much less Jesus in it. The entire poem is a monologue of a sort of existential sort, so that you hear the poem begin, "A cold coming we had of it." And on you go into a piece in which the psychology of the Magus is dark and almost grief-stricken and melancholy. Yes, there was a birth, but there was also death. Why does Eliot do this? Well, to remind us that there is something deep and real and profound in the Nativity, that it's not Santa Claus, it's not Hallmark cards, and to try to get beyond cliché, the cliché of late Romanticism, the bourgeois representation of this event, and to remind us in some ways that the crucifixion is present even at the Nativity. Writers like Graham Greene liked to play with the idea of heresy, the idea of the outcast, the excommunicate, the self-excommunicate, the person who is caught in an intolerable moral dilemma vis-a-vis the church, and whose gesture, again, has to be grand and in some ways melodramatic, although the writing is so spare and so powerful and so psychologically acute that it never comes off as mere melodrama. These are some of the great virtues of that generation of Christian writers. And please don't get the idea that anything that I say subsequent to this is in any way a degradation or a denigration of those writers. They were the writers who have made me whatever the heck I am. And in fact, it was those great Catholic writers who convinced me when I was in my early 20s to be received into the Roman Catholic Church. So I have a huge sense of piety, filial affection for these writers. But the conditions in which they wrote are not the conditions in which we live. And one of the things that, again, that I find to be interesting about the world as I tramp about it is that just as there's kind of resistance to the good news that I sometimes try to make the centerpiece of what I say, I think there's also resistance on the part of people who love this generation to other ways of doing things, to whispers rather than shouts. There is a kind of a shouters collective that is publicly unhappy about the whisperers, and I would like to try to address that conflict a little bit this evening. You can imagine why the writers used these techniques of high modernism. Not only were they part of the very aesthetic atmosphere of the early 20th century, but for Christians they corresponded to a sense of drastic secularization, the stripping, you might say, naked of the public square. And so a kind of forceful response, even forcefully ironic, was called for. We're at several removes from that now in the early 21st century. We live in a time when even those grand gestures are consistently questioned, called into question. Postmodernism, as you all know, doesn't have much time for master narratives. Those great controlling stories, whether the Judeo-Christian master narrative or even some of those high modern master narratives of Freud and Marx and Darwin. It's also a time in which people believe that presence is elusive. And even the idea of conveying presence through the silhouette might seem to be too bold, too forceful a gesture. We live in a time after a cultural and moral revolution in which religious authority has declined in its impact and power over people, where there has been poor, to say the least, catechesis, where a consumerist society fuels a do-it-yourself theology and church attendance, where individualism keeps us bowling alone. This is our world, for better or for worse. Fragmented, isolated, tentative, wounded, perhaps lost even. And yet, as Hamlet says in his speech in front of the actors, describing and extolling what they do, and he speaks, of course, for any artist when he describes what the actor does, he says the actor, and I say by implication the artist, is tasked with the mission of showing the form and pressure of the age, the form and pressure of the age. And that word pressure I like, both because of its modern connotation, but also don't forget its classical sense of an impression, a kind of stamp. Because the artist always works with the world around him. It is part of the experience in which he creates the work and reflects it back to us. So where are the works of art that engage faith appearing on this map, this schema of shouts and whispers? Well, in the whispering range for sure. The motto might be that of Eugene O'Neill, who ought to know the meaning of what he said when he said, "Man is born broken. He lives by mending. The grace of God is glue." Because what I find again and again in these contemporary works is a sense of woundedness, lostness, alienation from mainstream institutions, and yet at the same time both nostalgia and yearning, a desire to find a way to integrate. I sometimes get into friendly debates with my friend Jody Bottom, the literary editor of Weekly Standard. He's in the Shouters collective. He believes that these writers that I'm speaking about lack a kind of muscular Christianity. But what I would like to suggest is that sometimes the greatest strength is to be able to bend like the reed. And I think that some of the writers that are out there now, if we look at them carefully and with some sympathy, may yet convince us that their encounter with faith is every bit as genuine and powerful and moving as those of the earlier generation. Doris Betts wrote in that essay, "There's quite a range between characters like O'Connor's Hazel Motes in Wise Blood and Ann Tyler's quiet Ian Bedloe in St. Maybe, as there's a range between times when Jesus invades strongly against a generation of vipers and other times when he might stoop and silently scratch words in the ground." And that is what I find over and over again, an interest on the small scale, on the still small voice. And Tyler's St. Maybe might well be the quintessential example of this. It's a well-known novel. Ann Tyler is one of the very few writers these days who manages to combine true literary excellence with a large readership, a tricky thing to do in these days of packaged, marketed, New York-based trade publishing. You might recall that Ian Bedloe is a young man with a guilty conscience who feels that he has had some direct role in the death of a family member, and he seeks some answer to his grief, and he finds it in a kind of quasi-fundamentalist church, the church, appropriately enough in light of what I'm saying, called the Church of the Second Chance. And that book unfolds slowly, in quiet gestures, tentatively over time, and even at the end, there is a distinct lack of closure, a distinct lack of a dramatic conversion or a dramatic scene of epiphany and release. The idea you feel at the end is that this second chance business, this business of forgiveness and healing of grace, is one that takes an entire lifetime and perhaps peaks just over the edge of this lifetime as well. But Doris Betts' own Souls from the Dead, about the death of a 12-year-old girl, is poignant and powerful in its refusal to grant any happy endings. She talks about how many drafts of this novel she went through, how she brought in European specialists, miracles, all kinds of things in this novel to bring about a kind of grand religious gesture. But no, with an inexorable logic, the child dies, and the book embraces and somehow encompasses that event. Betts writes further in this essay, if in O'Connor's stories the grandmother recognizes the misfit and then perishes, or Mrs. Turpin gets called a warthog in two different ways, or the Holy Ghost continues implacable to descend from the ceiling stain, My own characters don't seem to earn such direct intervention. Like the descendants of Job's second cousins once removed, they struggle through a long weekday process that includes losses and boils, until in the end, God does not so much answer their questions as silence them, simply by being there, so that my characters end by saying, or maybe whispering, "Mine eye seeth thee." Some of them might add, "That is you, isn't it?" Take Ron Hansen's Mariette in Ecstasy as an example. Another powerful novel written by a man of unabashed, even fervent Catholic faith. But how is this book written? It's a fascinating thing. Ron told me that when he first wrote it, he thought he would have to send it to some pious Catholic publisher of catechetical tracts because there would be no market. Of course, in the end, HarperCollins took it and it became a bestseller. But it's the story of a young woman in a Carmelite convent at the beginning of the 20th century who experiences the stigmata. Now, what is the story about? Well, it's very familiar for some of us who knew the stage play and the film Agnes of God. Do you all remember Agnes of God? Which traded on every possible modern cliche about Catholicism as inherently sexually repressive and dark and twisted and perverted in a variety of ways. And oddly, Hansen decides to take on this very same territory. Sex, the religious life, celibacy, stigmata, miracles. But instead of coming up with a Freudian answer that this is repression and then therefore some kind of deformation of what it is to be human, he opens out the ambiguity on the other end. What if the stigmata are real? What if God is present? The story remains ambiguous. You can think what you want. He doesn't give a slam dunk that tells us we know that this young woman is experiencing a miracle, or we know that this woman is off her rocker. He leaves that ambiguity with us, but it's an ambiguity that resonates, as I say, with an openness toward transcendence. And so he's taking the modern Freudian idea and flipping it on its head. Very crafty, very interesting, very subtle in its own way. In the world of creative nonfiction, there are now a host of books that are, I would say, almost instant modern classics of stories of brokenness and stumbling return towards faith, stumbling toward ecstasy, perhaps. Take, for example, Kathleen Norris's books from Dakota onwards, telling about her literary life in New York, in the circle of high literature and poetry, and how awful it was, and how the sexual revolution left her feeling used and lost, and how she makes her way, of all things, back to the upper plains into South Dakota, back to the family homestead out in the middle of farming country, and wonder of wonders, as a Presbyterian laywoman, into the bosom of the Benedictine tradition. Powerful, enduring stuff that combines an interest in the resonances between poetry and liturgy and landscape and silence and monasticism. One could argue that Norris has done more for a reawakening of the meaning of monasticism than anybody since Thomas Merton. Or take the rather naughtier, perhaps raunchier writer Anne Lamott, who grew up in a very secular, progressive world in Marin County, north of San Francisco. She has become a beloved writer, despite her salty language and her rather checkered past of sex, drugs, rock and roll, drugs, sex, and then drugs and sex, which she chronicles in a kind of absolutely disarming way in books like Traveling Mercies. Here we have a conversion story that seems a long, long way from tolle lege. So Pammy one evening took me in for the abortion, and I was sadder than I'd been since my father died. And when she brought me home that night, I went upstairs to my loft with a pint of Bushmills and some of the codeine a nurse had given me for pain. I drank until nearly dawn. Then the next night I did it again, and the next night, although by then the pills were gone. And on it goes, this drug-induced stupor. The blood continues to flow from the abortion until at some point a mysterious presence shows up. The feeling was so strong that I actually turned on the light for a moment to make sure no one was there. Of course there wasn't, but after a while in the dark again, I knew beyond any doubt it was Jesus. I felt him as surely as I feel my dog lying nearby as I write this, and I was appalled. I thought about my life and my brilliant, hilarious, progressive friends. I thought about what everyone would think of me if I became a Christian, and it seemed an utterly impossible thing that simply could not be allowed to happen. I turned to the wall and said out loud, I would rather die. Unfortunately, over the coming days, she feels the presence again, a presence she describes as like a little cat trotting after her, wanting to be picked up and brought home. And so, after a church service where she had gone to a black gospel church that became and is still her home, she writes, I began to cry and left before the benediction, and I raced home and felt the little cat running along at my heels. And I walked down the dock past dozens of potted flowers under a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams. And I opened the door to my houseboat, and I stood there a minute, and then I hung my head and said, fuck it. I quit. I took a long, deep breath and said out loud, all right, you can come in. So this was my beautiful moment of conversion. Or take a number of contemporary poets, such as Mark Jarman, Scott Cairns, Kate Daniels, Paul Mariani, whose use of lyric shimmers in a tension between devotion and doubt. Mark Jarman's book Unholy Sonnets, I think, is one of the most powerful books of poetry in a long, long time. Powerful at times enough to perhaps make me feel that I hear an echo of the original Holy Sonnets of John Donne. Scott Cairns is a writer who has turned to Eastern Orthodoxy as a mode of giving him a theology and a sensibility and aesthetic that's open to mystery and embraces what he calls the apophatic tradition, which is the Eastern tradition par excellence, mystical, aware that we cannot define or reason our way into full knowledge of the mystery of God, aware that in some ways, like the postmodernists believe, that all our formulations are provisional, contingent, as in this poem, No Harbor. What if he did attain the long-desired harbor? What if at last he came to rest? The stillness of that projected circumstance revealed just why his most beloved theologies would not exactly satisfy, why allegory proved so sure to sink the heart in shallow waters. The ship, with its unfathomed hold of dim provisions, asked for more than this. No final harbor, nor the glib assurance of the pier, but something inarticulate and, well, inexhaustible. He'd meant to keep things moving, even so, but found his opinions worn a little thin and tinny, both in tenor and in tone. Terror sports a patent inconvenience, true enough, but stands, regardless, in an absolutely brighter light than calm, pleased, and overfed. The dead would surely tell him, if he'd asked them, that the play of giddy theater extends beyond the grave, continues unabated, beyond the fairest guess, and beyond his dream. One last example from contemporary literature, what I would call saints in unlikely guises stories. Two great Catholic novelists at work right now, although they've both confessed to complicated attitudes towards the church, as most of us have these days, are Oscar Uelos and Alice McDermott. And in a striking parallelism, which I doubt they could have had any knowledge of, within a very few years of each other, both wrote two of the most powerful accounts of saintliness, sanctity, that I know of in recent literature. Uelos' Mr. Ives' Christmas and Alice McDermott's Charming Billy. You might not think of these characters as saints. Mr. Ives is a pretty normal New York advertising man, an orphan who has developed an intense, pious Catholic faith, but a man who enjoys sensuality and is hardly a stuck-up sort of figure. His son becomes an almost saint-like, truly saint-like seminarian destined to be a priest, and perhaps a wonderful one. One day he is gunned down in the street inexplicably. This happens within a very short time of the novel's beginning, and the rest of the novel chronicles Mr. Ives' struggle with grief. Like Doris Spett's book, Souls Raised from the Dead, it talks about the weekday, the long weekday process of grace working in the lives of people. Not the grand gesture, not the moment of violence, let's say, in an O'Connor. And certainly not the kind of grand gesture even of the whiskey priest. In Charming Billy, we get a story that has even less direct relationship to overt religion, because the main character is a kind of bumbling loser in many ways, an endearing bumbling loser, a man who, powerful, romantic, innocent as a youth, found himself spurned in love, and it scarred him and wounded him for life. He becomes an alcoholic. He's unable to make much of his life, and yet, again and again in the novel, McDermott shows him as a man of great love and great empathy. He has this habit of writing little short notes to people, little one-sentence letters on the back of bar napkins and envelopes, and sending them out to people. If he had email, he'd be shooting them out as emails these days. One point, and one point only, in the entire McDermott novel where religion gets really mentioned in any way, it's a conversation in which the moment I'm about to refer to isn't even the center of the conversation. But at one moment, Billy bursts out and says, "What do you think Jesus really experienced on the cross? What was the nature of his suffering?" 2-3 paragraphs, casual conversation. And yet, of course, it's the linchpin of the entire novel for those with eyes to see. These saints are the saints of the weekday process, not the saints of the firing squad. They're people who have their own distant relation to church and authority and dogma. And yet, their journeys are not unlike the journeys of conversion and pilgrimage of any Christian writer or artist down the millennia. They might be saying with Eliot in 4 quartets, the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. One of the interesting and I think liberating things about this generation of whisperers is that they don't feel the need that the modernist generation had for indirection. So one of the things that you're discovering in a lot of these books is that religious experience, faith, church membership, participation, is now an acceptable subject matter for fiction and for poetry and for art and music. And the language of the traditional narratives and symbols has opened up in a way that it hasn't in an awful long time. You might say there's a trade-off. We have perhaps not the muscularity of the earlier generation, but we have perhaps a broader range of expression than the earlier generation. And as with all such trade-offs, it probably behooves us to think a little bit before voting one as immediately superior to the other. I think in some ways that it is possible to say that there is more than one way to evoke mystery. And the mystery of the whisper into the wounded soul is a way that seems to me to be powerful and persuasive and real. Walker Percy is a novelist who acts as something of a transitional figure for this process. He's somebody who has a foot in both camps. He has that same modern sense of the importance of big issues such as philosophy, and he's of course a Kierkegaardian. But he also senses what the postmodern world is like, where everything is leveled, high culture, low culture, modern, the momentary pop experience and the ancient traditional experience, all leveled on a level playing field. But if you look, and I wondered about this, if you look at who Percy commended in his later years, in his letters and his essays, he was commending a series of whisperers, not people that he was trying to find in his own image. And it wasn't until I really began to understand this that I began to see why Percy might have done that. Presence is elusive, faith perhaps wobbly in the world in which we live, but it's worth waiting for. In her poem, Opening Words, Denise Levertov, again a kind of transitional figure in this realm and a Catholic convert in her own way, put it this way: I believe the earth exists, and in each minim mote of its dust the holy glow of thy candle. Thou unknown, I know. Thou spirit, giver, lover of making, wrought letter, wrought flower, iron, deed, dream. Dust of the earth, help thou my unbelief. Drift gray become gold in the beam of vision. I believe with doubt. I doubt and interrupt my doubt with belief. Be, beloved, threatened world. Each minim mote, not the poisonous luminescence forced out of its privacy, the sacred lock of its cell broken. No, the ordinary glow of common dust in ancient sunlight. Be, that I may believe. Amen. And those words, not the poisonous luminescence forced out of its privacy, which I take to be a rejection of trying to coax mystery out into the broad daylight, but the ordinary glow of common dust in ancient sunlight. The cumulative effect of any of these works that I have may not equal those grand gestures of the earlier generation, but taken together, open-eyed, I believe they're saying the ancient things about faith: the need for forgiveness, repentance, healing of woundedness, the need for the glue of God's grace. Thank you for your patience.
We have time for some questions before we retire outside to the reception waiting for us. You'll notice that there's some microphones placed here and down here, and it will help us if you'll step to one of those microphones, and for those of you in the balcony, microphones up there. Eric Grabowski.
Eric Grabowski, Duquesne University. The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson was clearly a shout, not a whisper. And it seems to have had a lot of rhetorical success with regard to breaking through the culture. And maybe as a helpful, not necessarily counterpoint, but adjacent point, can you kind of context that into your conversation? Because it was a strikingly successful phenomenon in terms of getting people at least open to the question of the redemption?
Yeah. Well, I think there's been a lot of doubt about exactly how successful it was. I mean, there's no doubt that it was successful financially. And there's no doubt that it was successful in a very deep sense, culturally speaking. But a lot of people were claiming success in the sense of large-scale conversions. Just as people were predicting that there were going to be pogroms after this film, neither the pogroms nor the conversions seem to have happened. I think that the film was a shout. I think it precisely, I believe that it hit people truly who wanted a shout, who've been longing to hear a shout, who feel that everything's been not just a whisper, but mealy-mouthed mumbling. And I have great empathy for that. And I tried to write a piece on that film, which tried to give it some credit. There are aspects of the film that I think are an attempt to reawaken traditional Christian iconography in a way that hasn't been achieved in film either in a long time or ever. In particular, that film, I think the depiction of Mary is the miracle that comes out of that film more than anything else. In fact, Mary kind of steals the show a little bit, not through any grandstanding, but just through the emotional, spiritual resonance of her depiction is so much more achievable and achieved than the more ambitious attempt to depict Christ's suffering and death. So I completely agree with that. And I know there are people who are like, finally someone shouted, instead of mumbling. I'm just not sure that that's ultimately a way that is going to forge something that embraces a large enough universe of human experience. The danger is that it plays into the tribal, feeling of, yes, this is what we are, this is who we are, and in a way, there's a kind of devotion. It's a devotional work more than it's a dramatic work or anything else. So, yes, it is. But on the other hand, I feel that for an awful lot of human beings out there, it's precisely the kind of in-your-face thing that is not going to speak to them at all. And I know that some people think that we just have to shout louder is the answer. But I think maybe the paradox is that, like the reed, you bend, and in that bending and in that willingness to start from brokenness and lostness and alienation and work from the inside out, that you will gain far more traction towards the heart of the faith, the heart of the church in that way. So, yes and no.
Corinna Delkes-Camp-Hayes, and then, Father, if you'll step up and you'll be next.
Yes, hearing about whisper to me is of course always a great challenge because I tend to be a bit too noisy. So it was good to listen to that. I was just wondering, I do not know, unfortunately, the books you talked about. I have these great failings. But when I think about whispering and shouting, it seems to me that they can happen on two levels, on a formal and on a material level. Before I became a Christian, I was a European Protestant. And that is something very whispery on the content level. That is, one is usually so content with very soft and gentle and subtle allusions to something transcendent somewhere beyond, or some opening of something somewhere, that there is very little substance to what one wants to say. Now, taking this as a cue, I was just wondering, with the works you were discussing, were you at all concerned about how far this is really Christian and how far this is generally kind of spiritual something?
Yeah, I take that question very seriously. It's an ongoing question that I face every day as editor of a journal that publishes material that in some sense is supposed to be engaging the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I'm always asked, how do you make up your mind? And what I tend to say about the journal, and I think what I would tend to say about the people that I'm writing about, is that really there are two groups who I think ought to be treated very, very seriously. The first group is the group that is, I would say, I call it situated. People who are situated within historic creedal Christianity or observant Judaism. People like Ron Hansen, for example. But I also think there is another group of people, and I call them grapplers. I hate seeker. Seeker is such a lame word. I mean, I think it's a lame word that actually applies to a certain amount of stuff that is lame out there in the culture. But these grapplers are not quite so lame. They're like Jacob and the angel. They're people who may not be able to say the creed or kneel in the pew, but who are locked in some kind of death grip with the church, with faith. Someone like Oscar Hijuelos would be a very good example of that. Somebody who feels like he'll never be able to emerge from his estrangement, and yet he can't stop writing in ways that are deeply Catholic. I think a grappler is an artist who is being honest about where they are, and whose struggle is frankly not all that different from the struggle of the person who is situated. If the person who is situated was living out their faith the way Jesus and St. Paul and a few others told us to live it out, in fear and trembling. So in the pages of Image, and I think out in the broader culture, I really feel that the situated and the grapplers are two groups of artists that deserve our respect and our attention. There are people who will use religion as, I'd call it, wallpaper, or kind of like Muzak in their works, as symbolic system upon which to hang something. But I couldn't help but feel when you said what you said about the kind of polite and perhaps wan European, religiosity of somebody who is very European, but who is also very Christian these days, and that's the great film director Wim Wenders. Because Wim Wenders seems to me to be somebody who is taking that European sensibility, which we Americans are slightly pissed off with right now, and actually do something profound, do something that sensibility at its best evokes, which is a more tentative, ambiguous, non-shouting, non-triumphalist kind of attitude. And he's having a hard time with it. His latest film, Land of Plenty, which explores the American experience in the part of a young American girl who's an evangelical visiting an uncle who's a war vet and who's gung-ho for all the current war efforts, can't find a distributor in America. I mean, this is the man who made, Wings of Desire. So I think that, yes, there's something red-blooded one about faith, but there's Whisper may be worth doing materially and formally at times. Sometimes they need to be done together. Sometimes they can be different. The formal and the material can be different. So let 100 flowers bloom, I guess, is my general philosophy.
Robert Lord of St. John's University in New York. I was wondering if you're familiar with Mark Salzman's Lying Awake. Seems to illustrate perfectly what you're talking about.
Well, you caught me out because that's one I haven't read.
Okay.
Although I know enough to know that the ambiguity that I talked about in Marion and Ecstasy between, you might say, the physical and the spiritual is played out in that novel because of her physical condition. So what's physical, what's spiritual, that's apparently very richly treated in that book.
That's right. And then when she gives up what she thinks are experiences of God for the sake of the community, she seems to reach a higher level of spirituality. So I think it illustrates very well what you were talking about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ralph Wood from Baylor. Thank you very much, Greg, for a splendid lecture. I think the distinctions you made tonight are just exactly right. I would ask you, however, to add two other figures to your list that seem to me to be whisperers of a very high order. The first being Richard Wilbur. You probably know an Anglican poet working in Connecticut with a profound sense of the holiness of the ordinary. His poetry, it seems to me, is unexcelled in our time for its Christian depth, but in this very quiet, subtle, non-shouting way. The other is a Baptist, Wendell Berry, who was essayist, novelist, poet, living in a little town called Port Royal, Kentucky, farming 125 acres of land. A poet in whom, and writer in whom the words Christ, church, cross, sin hardly ever appear, but all of which are figured deeply by the words farm, household, land, earth. The best place I'm advertising for him here to start is his book called The Art of the Commonplace, the agrarian essays of Wendell Berry, and his poems, The Timbered Choir, and other volumes. Would you agree that those should be added?
Absolutely, and without equivocation, yes. They're truly great American writers. And like the greatest writers, at times they're underappreciated. I mean, Richard Wilbur, who often writes in formal verse, is the most unsexy poet on the planet to the kind of mainstream poetry establishment. And he won't get the appreciation he deserves until long after he's gone to his reward. Well, Barry, what can you say about Barry? I mean, he's a writer who I think is one of the very few living who has what I would call a prophetic stature. Solzhenitsyn is another, Jeffrey Hill is another, but certainly Wendell Berry is a marvel.
Thank you. I'm happy to say I just signed a letter to Wendell Berry asking him to come whisper here on campus next semester, so maybe we'll get him here. Tris Engelhardt.
Tris Engelhardt, I'm a philosopher, so I think about beauty, but don't really appreciate it that much firsthand. And I was listening to the dialogue between you and Corinna Delkus, and I wonder if the cleft is not between shouters and whispers, but something you hinted at what one stands in fear and trembling before, whether one's in fear and trembling before the very presence of God or before one's doubt. And that's where the cleft lies.
Well, in a deeper human sense, that's the ultimate cleft. I'm really speaking about the way in which writers and artists have, under different cultural circumstances over the past 70, 80 years, tried to embody the fear and trembling. And I do think there are noticeable patterns. Of course, there are exceptions everywhere. I'm sure I was surprised people haven't said, well, there's these 5 whisperers in the earlier period you didn't mention, and these shouters right now. But I completely, I'm open to those realities. But I do feel that there are two very different types of response. And I guess because I've come out of a more conservative background myself personally, that a lot of my deepest friends are the people who sit around grumping about the fact that people aren't shouting loud enough these days. And for me, it's come as kind of an epiphany that maybe that isn't the right way to go about things. Maybe the deepest faith right now is the faith that is expressed in the whisper, that bending reed rather than the iron hammer. So many conservatives these days seem to feel that they're single-handedly got all their fingers and toes in the dike, and then if they pull one out of the dike, the whole thing's going to come crashing down, But sometimes the best way to fight is to yield.
We'll have time for 2 more questions. Donald Flute, who is the campus authority on Robert Hugh Benson, a shouter for sure, and then Laura Garcia, and then we'll go to the break. But Donald first.
Okay. I was wondering if we could probe this basic image just a little bit further along the lines of the interaction that happens in a shout and in a whisper. There seems to me to be something much more intimate about a whisper. I mean, you can stand on a soapbox and shout anywhere in Hyde Park or Central Park, and whether people gather or not is sort of up in the air. But a whisper implies some sort of connection between who's doing the whispering and who's being whispered to. And so I was wondering if you'd like to reflect on the audiences of the shouters and the whisperers. And that might be another way to look at the problematic, who's being spoken to here.
Sure.
That we have this more intimate mode going on now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I touched on a few of the conditions. I think the earlier shouters were people who were interested in the larger public square. They were interested in the stripping of the square of faith. And their gestures were gestures that were intended to in some ways counter what some of the alternatives being touted in that time were. So you find that a lot of these writers I'm talking about felt that totalitarianism of left or right, or creeping socialism, creeping secular liberalism, were threats, and a lot of them had a philosophical dimension. I mean, particularly the Americans, Percy and O'Connor, they used philosophy. Hazel Motes is kind of Nietzsche as a country boy, and Binks Bowling is kind of Kierkegaard as a kind of lost 20-something in New Orleans. They used philosophy to kind of oppose the other big ideological master narratives of the 20th century. It was more public, more philosophical, more political in a sense. I mean, there are exceptions. I would say, Diary of a Country Priest is moving much more in the intimate direction. For example, the French, were being more intimate there. My argument is that the difference now is that those are not the issues that are our issues. Those issues of the immediate sense of the sudden absence of religion from the public square. I'm talking about a privatized, fragmented, consumerist, individualized, bowling alone world in which the intimate is the only thing where real connection can even happen. And some of these writers are clearly trying to build little tiny, Legos on top of each other to get towards larger structures. I mean, a really young writer, Haven Kimmel, in a novel, I mean, she's like barely 30, wrote a lovely novel recently called The Solace of Leaving Early, which uses Whitehead's process philosophy in a kind of little existential love story. And it's sort of a bit Percy-esque and interesting that it's kind of combining these things. There's a natural rhythm in the pendulum, but I think the intimacy is because we're shoved down into our individual relationships, and there's real loss there, but there's also gain. After all, intimacy is a powerful thing and a real thing, and faith may ignite there.
A final question from Laura Garcia up in the balcony.
Hi, I teach philosophy. Is this on? No.
Nope.
Stand closer. Oh, does that work? Okay. I'm a philosopher too, so I'm not speaking from any expertise, but I was wondering...
A little louder, Laura.
Okay, I was wondering when you were talking about whisperers, whether there's such a thing as whispering in a more positive vein, say holding out some hope or normalcy or something besides their inner agony and so forth. And I guess I was thinking in part of some of Walker Percy's earlier things like Love in the Ruins, where he swallows Christ in the Eucharist, he makes love with his wife, he hums going back and forth to church. It makes that seem very attractive, but just very normal, like it's part of his life. It's not wallpaper exactly, but it's not shouting. Or maybe even McInerney's Father Dowling character or something. I mean, the religious themes come in, but there's also an attractiveness about the person, just because they're not hooked on the consumerist angst and so forth. What I'm afraid, I guess, is that the whispers that you've mentioned, do a good job of showing us our woundedness, our need for healing, and so on. But what I'm afraid of is that then people will just try to drown that out by more consumerism or eating disorders or suicidal thoughts or Prozac or whatever it takes. I mean, at least when I look at the college students I deal with, that's what I worry.
Thank you. Well, that's a good question. There are happy whisperers. Haven Kimmel, this younger writer I told you, is really truly a comedic talent. I didn't touch on a lot of comedy. There are comic writers out there. James Wilcox. Who are some others? Oh, I'm sorry? Okay. All right. Aaron McGraw, wonderful writer. I think taking over J.F. Powers' mantle as a writer about priests and about kind of parish life with a kind of lot of dark humor. You know, I think that the suffering and the woundedness in these writers that I'm talking about is to me, a lot of them are Catholic, and it's a kind of Catholic tragic sense of life. I mean, it's why Catholics have a crucifix on the wall and not the empty cross. So I don't think it's a sense of, you know, gee, how depressing life is. It's about dealing with pain. I mean, I teach students too, and one thing I see with students is that they're going through, you know, their parents are divorcing and they have eating disorders, and one of the things that, you know, I'm in an evangelical institution, and I sometimes worry about, and I don't know whether Catholics are better insulated against this, but I feel that in my institution, you know, the religious answers are all too easy, and you know, kind of like putting some little whipped cream on, you know, on the thing rather than some real deep healing salve. So I hear you, but I think if America needs anything right now, it's a theology of suffering that is different than mere depression or angst. We're schizophrenic people. We're addicted to being on uppers all the time, and then we crash. There's no tragic sensibility in America. We just don't have it. We rejected it when we founded the country. Europe is all that old tragic, dark tragic stuff. You know, we're the New Start type. So I am a bit of a suffering guy. You know, I read Simone Weil and I think, I love this woman. So you know, you're probably pointing out a real tendency, but I bet you I could find a few happier guys around too. Anyway, you've been very, very. Is this the last one?
I think we should stop there.
I think so.
And I'll give you the last two reminders. There is a sumptuous reception right out here. And Kate Wilson, Kate, raise your hand. We'll be right down here. The undergraduates who have any questions, Kate can answer all of them. And please join me in thanking Greg Wolfe for this wonderful talk.